Dan Szczesny is a longtime journalist, author, and speaker living in New Hampshire. He's written several books of travel and memoir, and his book, The Nepal Chronicles, about a month-long trek to Everest Base Camp and marriage in Kathmandu, won the 2016 New Hampshire State Library Award for Outstanding Work of New Fiction. He's also the editor of the Murder, Inc. series, a series of New England-based pulp fiction anthologies set in and around the newsroom. Volume 3 was released just in February of this year. His latest book, The White Mountain, will be available June 26th. Dan spent a year exploring the very heart of the White Mountains, including Mount Washington, home of the world's worst weather, the cultural and natural soul of climbers and tourists from around the world, from car races to bird watching, from bikes to motorcycles, from the railroad to the stars, to a centuries-old observatory, Mount Washington, speaks to the adventure in all of us, and Dan turned his veteran journalist's eye toward capturing it all in his new book. You can pre-order it. Dan has written for a wide variety of publications, including the Mainline Times, the Philadelphia Weekly, Christian Science Monitor, and the Huffington Post. He writes an occasional column for Good Men Project called Modern Dad, about getting kids into nature and the challenges of being an older dad, and for Folded Word called Write Life, about the writing industry. And if you'll bear with me for just a second, I'm going to introduce Steve and Judy, and then Dan is going to take over. Local author S.J. Cahill is a Pushcart Prize and Zank Book Award nominee. His prize-winning fiction was featured in Gemini Magazine and the Arlington Literary Journal and selected for inclusion in the Best of Guyville Press short stories. His work appears in 7 of the Murder, Inc. anthologies. He has also appeared in Vermont Magazine, Kind of a Hurricane, Good Living Review, and his poetry can be found in The Mountain Troubadour. Kingdom writer Judith won the Soul-Making Keats Award, the Vermont Award for Continuing Education in Writing, and the Anita McAndrews Poets for Human Rights Award. She was a Dana Award finalist and received writers' grants to the Vermont Studio Center and the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. Her writing and fiction have appeared in Puckerbush Review, Kind of a Hurricane, The Mountain Troubadour, and Vermont Magazine. Her stories appeared in 2 volumes of Murder, Inc. An excerpt from her novel will appear in the summer issue of The Meadow. Here is Dan Szczesny to start us off.
Wow, thank you, everybody. This is a great crowd. I couldn't be happier to be speaking in front of the Cahill family reunion. No, I'm kidding. Only half of the crowd is Steve's family. We're gonna be talking about pulp fiction and film noir today, actually. And I wanted to just give you a little bit of background first of all, to put into context what you're going to be hearing from Judith and Steve today. Murder, Inc. Is an anthology series published by Plaid Swede Books. They're out of Concord, New Hampshire. The publisher is the great George Gears, who's a newspaper man for all of his life, probably going on 50 years of his life now, down in southern New Hampshire. And this is a regional series. It's by New England authors. All of the stories are set someplace in New England. You may, in fact, recognize some of the locations of Steve's stories. They're set in the Northeast Kingdom. Judith's stories are set down on the coast of Maine. George, over at Plaid Swede, actually this is following a series of what are called the Live Free anthologies. Live Free or Sci-Fi, Live Free or Die, 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 Live Free or Love Free or Die, Live Free or Sci-Fi. There's Live Free or Ride, which came out just as a Western series, which just came out last fall. And this fall is an anthology series that both Steve and I actually have a story. Do you have a story in too, Jude? No. That both Steve and I have a story in, a fantasy series called Live Free or Dragons. So I have a couple of copies of those books as well, but those are very New Hampshire focused. And Steve is in 3 of those? 2 of those? Yeah, Steve is in a bunch of those too. They're really cool genre stories. If some of you are into that, there's a little something for everyone in those books. But today we're here to talk about pulp fiction. And what is pulp fiction? And what is film noir? And they intersect pretty closely. And I wanted to give it's about a 10-minute slideshow presentation, just to give you a little bit of context about what the series is about and what you're going to be hearing from Steve and from Judith. Steve has a story in each of the 3 volumes of Murder 1, 2, and 3. It's an interconnected story. They're all standalone, but if you read them, if you publish them in book form, which I hope someone will do someday, you can read them all as one long piece. And Judith, her stories are in volume 2 and volume 3, and they also are set in the same coastal town of Maine with the same newspaper editor and the same sort of small town politics and murder. So it's pretty interesting stuff. But everything actually begins with this guy. Does anybody know who he is? He's just a generic 19th century English gentleman. This is Frank Munsey. He was from Maine, actually very close to where Judith sets her stories. He lived from, I have a lot of notes here, so I want to get some of the numbers right. He was from 1854 to 1925. He is the founder, the creator, and the developer of what we now know as pulp fiction or film noir. He was an entrepreneur at the time, which basically meant he always had a new scheme going. He was always looking to make a quick buck down there on the coast of Maine in the 1880s, 1890s. And he was a storyteller. He had a couple of kids, and he always used to tell them stories before bed. Back then, magazines were expensive and glossy and on heavy stock. Subscribing to a magazine was an expensive thing to do. And newspapers didn't tell a whole lot of fiction, a whole lot of fictional stories. And it was tough to get newspapers from around the country anyway, because again, you're dealing with heavy stock and heavy paper. So Frank got a job. I'm going to take this. I'm at that stage in my life, by the way, where I can't see with or without my glasses. So you'll have to bear with me. He got a job at the Western Union Telegraph Office. And this put him in touch basically with the rest of the world, or at least the rest of the country. And he began going back and forth with other newspapers. He began becoming interested in reporting and in journalism. And specifically, he began becoming interested in the use of high-speed presses, which were a thing at the time, to publish on cheap, untrimmed paper, right? So around the 1890s, 1900, newspapers began beginning an assembly lineage. They began actually publishing on a lot lesser stock. It's the type, nowadays, some do, some don't, but if you open a newspaper and the ink comes off in your hand, that means the stock, the paper stock, is a cheaper paper stock. And he became interested in how newspapers at the time were beginning to be able to print a lot of newspapers for a real low cost. And what he wanted to do was turn that idea into magazines. So what he did was he moved to New York, and he started a glossy magazine called Argosy. At first, Argosy was just a boys' magazine. It was a young adult kids' magazine. It dealt with camping, ways to tying knots, building fires. It was kind of like an early Boy Scout type of thing. But it was really unsuccessful. And part of the reason why it was unsuccessful is because he was having trouble getting subscriptions. It was very high cost. A magazine subscription at the time would cost you 50 cents or 60 cents a magazine. That was a lot of money back then. And no one was subscribing. So he used the techniques that he learned at the telegraph station and through his interactions with newspaper journalists to begin publishing Argosy on very cheap stock. Very, very cheap, almost the leftovers. He would buy the leftover stock from these newspapers, run it through these high-speed presses, and he was able to actually make these magazines, you can see, 10 cents. 10 cents a magazine. That was a much nicer price for a magazine buying audience of the time. That's where the term pulp fiction came from. That's what newspapers used to call the old stock, would be pulp fiction. It was pulpy stock. So he began publishing Argosy. It was a pulp fiction magazine. He threw out the idea of publishing for just boys. And he realized, again, based on journalism, based on the newspapers of the time, the stories that sold were the stories that were, titillating, a little scandalous. Gossip rags, that was a big thing at the time. Laddie mags, that was a big thing at the time. So he decided that he was going to go full-on genre stories. He was going to publish science fiction and detective stories, gumshoes, femme fatales. You can see here is a sea girl, so it's a sort of a femme fatale mermaid. And it really took off. The Argosy began this wave of pulp fiction magazines that lasted for all the way through World War II. And I have some kind of incredible numbers. In 1903, Argosy was published. There was 500,000 subscribers to Argosy across the country. 500,000 in 1903 were subscribing to this magazine. That's enormous. No other magazine was even coming close. But he started this wave of pulp fiction magazines. There was a magazine called Penny Dreadfuls, or dime novels, right? Those are some of the ones that I actually have for you over in the bin over there, these dime novels, also published on this really cheap pulp fiction stock. The covers, I was talking to somebody over there about, he was just looking at the covers, because the covers are all designed to sort of draw you in a sort of cheap titillating sort of way. And it was very, very successful business for a long time. In fact, the modern superheroes of, the movies are all superhero movies now. The modern superheroes of today are all descendants from the pulp fiction heroes, guys like The Shadow or Doc Savage or the Phantom Detective. Argosy got into sports in the 19-teens and 1920s. When the New York Yankees were a big deal, and Babe Ruth and all those guys were around, so they were sort of picking up on a lot of the cultural, what was happening in the culture. They were publishing short fiction based on that too. And Argosy published all the way into the 1980s. There's Charles Bronson there, where they started publishing interviews and started looking at detective movies, and they went out of business in 1984. So while they were big, though, at the peak of this sort of pulp fiction phase, the 1920s and the 1930s, there was mostly out of New York City, there was 150 pulp fiction magazines that were being published around the country, 150. World War II paper shortages happened and basically put the pulp fiction business more or less out of business. So circulation dropped. The TV showed up, and a lot of detective stories and so forth started showing up in people's living rooms in that black and white box. So in 1957, American News Corps went under. That was the big publishing house that was publishing a lot of these pulp fiction magazines, not Argosy, but most of the other ones. And that sort of began the descent of pulp fiction. So what happened then is in 1944, there's one of the early pulp fiction magazines, Phantom Detective, all the blondes, red dresses, femme fatale was a big thing. In 1944, this movie came out. Does anyone know what this movie is? Yes, Double Indemnity, very good. And Double Indemnity changed everything. This was the crossover period between pulp fiction and detective fiction being in print, and pulp fiction and detective fiction being on the big screen. James McMurtry, Barbara Stanwyck, and Barbara Stanwyck was the first, there were others before her, but she was the first really big femme fatale. And the idea of the femme fatale, this beautiful woman who uses her sensuality and her womanly attributes to convince or destroy, in most cases, a detective, or in this case, an insurance agent, right? James McMurtry plays an insurance agent. became a really big deal. What's interesting is that the original story, Double Indemnity, written by James Caan, came out a year earlier and was published in a pulp fiction magazine called Liberty. It was published in a series, 9 magazines over the course of 9 months, Double Indemnity, before being made into a movie. So this is a true crossover, right? This is the ultimate detective pulp fiction femme fatale story coming out in a monthly subscription, and then 6 months later becoming this movie that really changed the course of film noir. Here's a couple of other covers that I like and that I particularly like. You know, they put it all out there in some of these on some of these covers. You know what you're getting. Mickey Spillane, of course, one of the most popular, the Mike Hammer mysteries, one of the most popular pulp fiction writers of his time. So let's look at some of the results of Double Indemnity. This is Kathleen Turner, of course, in Body Heat. This is 1981, I believe, 81, 82, something like that. Again, the standard femme fatale who uses everything at her fingertips to get what she wants, to kill her. She kills her husband, and this other, destroys this other detective. Sharon Stone, of course, in Basic Instinct. And then, in the early 90s, a guy by the name of Quentin Tarantino came along. He's been in the news a lot, controversially, but in his earlier work, Tarantino did something interesting to pulp fiction and to the film noir. He turned the femme fatales around. So the femme fatales became the good guys, became the protagonists, as opposed to the antagonists of his film. I mean, heck, even his most famous film is called Pulp Fiction, with Uma Thurman. But Jackie Brown, a famous actress who had a comeback with Quentin Tarantino. Pam Grier in Jackie Brown. That's not in Jackie Brown. And there's a femme fatale who actually became the hero of the story. Inglourious Bastards, which is the Melanie Laurent, who was the femme fatale of that movie, and she became she's such a protagonist in this alternative history version of the movie that she kills Hitler. That's how much of a hero she is in this movie. So those are the two legs, right? We have the pulp fiction magazines, and we have film noir. The third piece of the puzzle, which you're going to be hearing from Steve and from Judith, is how the newsroom plays a role, and journalism plays a role in this series. This is James Caan. And one of the things that I found that was really interesting is that if you go through the list of those early 1930s, 1940s, 1950s pulp fiction writers and producers and film noir directors, they all have connections to journalism. James Caan started his career as a reporter for the Baltimore American and the Baltimore Sun. That's Damon Runyon of Guys and Dolls fame. He worked for a handful of Hearst Corporation newspapers. That's Raymond Chandler. Raymond Chandler worked in the Army. He was actually a journalist. He worked at the Army newspaper. He was a reporter in the Army. And there's Raymond Chandler, author of The Big Sleep, maybe the most famous pulp fiction writer. He was a reporter at the Daily Express and the Western Gazette. So the idea of newspapers, of sort of the little journalist, the underpaid, hard-drinking, smoking, newspaper beat reporter, fighting, winning one for the big guy, for the little guy, came out of a lot of these writers who were journalists in their early years. This was an important movie that brought all of those three legs of that stool together. Has anyone seen Deadline USA with Humphrey Bogart? It's a really obscure movie now. Back then it wasn't. It was Ethel Barrymore's one of her, I think it was her second to last film. She plays the publisher of a dying newspaper. Humphrey Bogart plays the managing editor of this newspaper, and they're going after mob corruption, right? And the newspaper is going under, and the mob is threatening to shut them down, both with physical violence, but also to pull their funding. And the whole story, the entire movie, revolves around whether or not they should publish this piece bringing down a mob boss, knowing that if they publish it, the newspaper will fail and they'll all be out of jobs. That's the premise of this movie. It's an amazing, interesting movie. It's 1943, 45, something like that. And it really established the lowly newspaper man as the journalist for the people. You know, the guy who's looking out, the little man who's looking out for the little man. And in the end, there's a famous scene in the end. I'm gonna spoil it for you, but you should go see the movie anyway. There's a famous scene in the end where Humphrey Bogart is in the press room, and he's on the phone with the mob boss, and the mob boss is threatening him. And the paper is ready to go to press, and Humphrey Bogart has to decide whether or not to publish this story. And the mob boss is screaming at him in the phone. You know, if you do this, you're gonna be out of a job. I'm gonna put the paper under. You'll never work in this town again. And Bogey just looks, you know, as Bogey, you know, Bogey is Bogey, right? And Bogey just looks over at the pressman and he just nods. And the presses start running. And the mob boss on the phone says, "What's that? What's that noise?" And Bogey holds the phone up and he says, "It's the press, baby, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." And it set off this series of movies. This is a Jimmy Stewart movie called Call Northside 777. This is 1952, where he plays a young, scrappy reporter, not well paid, hard drinking, you know, working till 3 a.m. to get this guy off of death row in time, you know, before they pull the handle on him. And even a modern movie, this came out 2 years ago, Nightcrawler, starring Jake Gyllenhaal. How the femme fatales went from being the protagonist to antagonist to the protagonist. The newspaper man has now gone from being the protagonist to the antagonist. A lot of newspaper movies, noir and Pulp Fiction-y newspaper movies now, the newspaper man now does not have the same reputation as a Bogey or a Jimmy Stewart used to back in the 40s. Jake Gyllenhaal plays a cameraman, a newspaper cameraman who does some pretty devious things to get some interesting shots. So that kind of brings us full circle. This is just a 15-minute, I could teach a class on Pulp Fiction and film noir, but this is just a really quick 15-minute overview of how we get to where we are today with Judith and with Steve, and this set of books. The contributors to these books had not very big guidelines, 1,000 to 8,000 words. Make sure it's set in New England and has something to do with the newsroom, and give it a Pulp Fiction feel. And Judith and Steve have done an amazing job by doing that. If I want to, real quick, before I introduce, I'm going to introduce Judith first, and then she's going to do a reading, and then Steve will do a reading. But before I go to them, I wanted to just take 1 minute. If anybody has any questions about Pulp Fiction or anything I could better put into context for you before Steve and Judith come up? No?
What was the great film with Steve Martin where, you know, he totally like ripped on like 10 different
Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
Yeah, that's a great film.
Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid.
With Steve Martin, which is a parody of the detective film noir. Yeah, that was a really good movie.
Yeah, and
He actually physically puts himself like in Casablanca, and he puts himself in a bunch of the classic movies. That was a cool movie too.
Yeah.
Well, you explained where Pulp Fiction came out of Maine and all that, but when you brought in this French term, film noir, you kind of left the French out of it when it came to the screen.
Yes, you are correct. There is... Noir didn't come out of nowhere, right?
The gentleman you asked, where's French film noir in all of this? I was just focusing on Hollywood. But the idea of noir, of course, did come from French cinema. And in the 1940s and the 1950s, it wasn't just French cinema. The English were putting out noir films, and the Italians were putting out amazing noir films. There was probably a good 10, 15-year period, late 40s to maybe mid-60s, where just some of the cinematography, if you look at, particularly in French films, where sort of the mood and the look of the film played a really important role. You can see that noir was actually a thing, not just in this country, but I just focused on it for this country. I was just focusing on some of the films that we would recognize. Yeah. Cool. Okay, do you want to hear some reading from this thing? And I'll stop talking. Thanks. Oh, thank you. I want both Judith and Steve to talk to you a little bit about their stories, and I'm going to let them do that, so I don't want to spoil anything for you. And I know Steve is going to talk a little bit about each of your stories, right? I mean, to sort of put everything in context. I'll let them do it. But I had no. You as an editor, you get dozens and dozens of submissions, and I don't really want to. I don't like starting to read the submissions until the deadline passes. So we get the deadline, and then I have a pile of 150 submissions and these giant stories that I have to go through, and it's always really nice when I find myself reading the story and losing myself in it, and I just put my red pen away because the stories are so good. And those are the stories that I love to get. And from both Steve and from Judith, that's the stories that I got when I picked up their stories. After the first couple of paragraphs, I was just reading their story. I wasn't even editing. The editing came later. I'm going to introduce Judith first. Judith is the winner of the Soul-Making Keats Award and the Vermont Award for Continuing Excellence in Writing. She was a finalist for the Dana Award. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in Pucker Brush Review, The Mountain Troubadour, Vermont Magazine, and in Murder Inc. 2 and Murder Inc. 3. Her work is perfectly designed for this collection. It is a small town newspaper. Especially in this book, it's the relationship between the small town editor and his main reporter, Rocco, and they have this incredible relationship of tracking down these coastal fishermen murders. And I knew right from the beginning, right from the first couple of paragraphs, that this was going to be it. I only wish that she had submitted to Murder Inc. 1. So I'm just going to introduce Judith, and we'll go from there. Judith Janroo, everybody.
Thank you all for coming. This is so fun, so good. I first want to thank Dan for being a truly wonderful editor. He really treats writers as people.
Well, they are, most of them.
And thank you all for hosting us. We really appreciate it. This is the continuing saga of Ted Holmes, newspaper editor who solved a murder in Volume 2. And this story is called Tangled Trawl Lines. Can you all hear me? Amazing. I had no life outside this small newsroom in Holmesport, Maine. I'd imagined one once, but the woman drifted into someone else's port. It was quiet here at the crack of dawn, except for the song, Only the Lonely, swimming in my brain. From my window, I watched fog crawl along the fishing wharves jutting out into the harbor. I went back to browsing my special edition on the lobstering industry, hoping to expand our readership. I needed Rocco's fishing news before I could lay out this week's broadsheet. His copy shaped our spread. So far, I had an article on the floating wheelchair for handicap access to our town beach, a Russian fishing trawler reported inside the 3-mile limit, and a marine biologist writing about the regenerating power of lobster claws. 10 years ago, I'd moved back to Homesport, sold my Roy Orbison collection, sunk my savings, and mortgaged a kidney to buy the Coastal Chronicle. I hired Rocco, 190 pounds of prime newshound, to hustle up and down the coast, selling 2-inch column ads and logging the fishing news. He'd been at it ever since. Today, he came in like high tide at full moon. "What's our catch of the day?" I said. Rocco rested one hand on my desk. "Brace yourself, Ted. Sheriff found Mo Bailey's body on Shag Island, nose down in a tide pool." I was stunned. It was hard to catch my breath. What happened? "Sheriff claims he got tangled in his trawl line and yanked overboard." "Not Mo," I said. "He's been lobstering for 40 years. He trained half the stern men in town. He even tried to train me to do real work. Did the wind kick up? Steady as a clammer's rake at mid-tide." "Mo Haley gets caught in his own trap line," I said. "That sound like Mo to you?" "Not the Mo I know." Rocco closed his eyes like God was talking to him. He tended toward the meditative, so I gave him a minute. I'd been working on a profile of Mo Haley. He was 15 when he started as stern man, all 6 unfolding feet of him. A tenant of the ocean, like most fishermen of Homesport, he saw land as a place to fuel up, spoon with his wife, and catch some Z's before getting back out on the water where he could breathe. But he wasn't breathing now. What was happening to our picture postcard town? "We can't run this." Rocco pulled out his smartphone and flashed a photo of Mo wearing a flannel shirt and gray Dockers, his tailbone pitched skyward like a sundial. Around his waist was a belt that inflated when submerged, like a chia plant. "Looks like he's been at a Hawaiian luau," Rocco said. "Charlotte made him wear it because most fishermen can't swim," which is true. "We better get this tied down," I said, "before the news blows up the coast like a nor'easter and the big hoo-has come in from the state." We're a small weekly, but our readers know we don't throw out a line just to see what we can catch. They know when we're printing the truth because we're writing about them. That's the thing with a small paper. You may not have the global pulse, but you have your slice of life, and readers trust you'll get it right. Otherwise, the Ladies' Aid will bring a broom to your newsroom. "Mo knew rope," I said. "He'd never leave loose line underfoot." "Doesn't figure," said Rocco. "I'm off to the coroner." He'd read my mind. That happened with Rocco and me. A lot went without saying. Maybe it was because we were the backbench of the paper and generated so many words. Or maybe it was growing up by the ocean and the clockwork of tides, the endless wash of sound. "I'm headed down to talk to Zeke Stone," I said. Zeke had moved to Homesport 2 years ago and built a wharf that encroached on Mo's. It restricted passage for both of them. There had been confrontations, Mo's bow line cut, Zeke's nose repositioned, and threats of a lawsuit. Mo's death looked like an accident, but I was suspicious, and like his life, it deserved a decent, factual portrayal. I was thinking about headlines, but I'd been fishing without a boat until I got word from the coroner. I downed another cup of rocket fuel and a chunk of raisin muffin for roughage and left to find Zeke Stone. Tanned, his top shirt buttons undone, Zeke was on his canopied wharf entertaining a stylish couple, obviously members of the 1%. The man wore a white linen shirt. The fingers and wrists of the blonde glistened like the diamonds in Lucy's sky. "I hate to interrupt, Zeke," I said. "I guess you've heard the news about Mo's death." "I have," Zeke sighed, "a tragedy." He gave me a once-over that said my Reporters Without Borders t-shirt was trespassing on his property. I wanted to ask about the assault charge he had brought against Mo when Mo's wife came charging down the wharf. Charlotte Haley was a spry woman and went to swinging at Zeke. "You did it," she cried. "You did this to Mo." I hated to see her make a fool of herself, so I stepped in and held her arms. "Charlotte, please." "This man was trying to drive Mo out," she said, "but I never thought he'd kill him." "Your husband and I had our differences," Zeke rolled his eyes, "but I plan to settle them in court." "See how heartless he is, and after the sheriff found Mo like that?" Charlotte's lower lip began to tremble. "I'm sorry, Charlotte," I said, "but the media will never see that picture." "Not the picture," her eyes began to fill. "He lost his teeth. I won't give him a service without his teeth. He never let anyone see him without them, even me." Poor woman loses her husband of 40 years, and it's his missing teeth that most distressed her. I felt a deep sadness as I watched her walk away. I had a lot to learn about women. I was looking forward to that entanglement. I was trying to imagine why someone would want to harm a man like Mo when I felt my boxers vibrate. It was Rocco on the phone. "Most likely dead before he hit the water," he said. "They're sending Mo's body for an autopsy. They'll check for water in the lungs, but he was bludgeoned, back of the head, from the indentation of the skull and the line of the fracture, probably something metal." Nothing accidental about that, I thought. The Charlotte May was back at Mo's Wharf. I went over to take a look. The wind was picking up, and the rubber tires Mo had hung over the sides of his boat for fenders bounced lightly against his wharf. The sky was soapstone, with only a smudge of sun along the horizon. For a moment it shone on the Charlotte May, and I saw something flicker. I knelt and felt around inside the tire, a slimy grab bag of barnacles, seaweed, a Moxie can, and a heavy piece of metal. I knew it would match the fracture on Mo's skull. An adjustable crescent wrench, an 18-inch clutch. Now I had to find the hand that used it. Another lobster boat, the Grace Louise, came into the harbor and tied up at Mo's Wharf. Grace Goodrow had been the one to spot Mo's boat drifting out of the harbor. I wonder what she'd seen, what she knew. I hadn't seen Grace up close since high school. I went away, she went away down Port Clyde way. I'd missed what had developed under those yellow oilskins. She slid out of the slick overalls, and a fawn-colored t-shirt blossomed before me. It was almost more than cotton fabric could contain. Cut-off jeans and long tanned legs. Amazing grace. I took a breath and hazarded a few steps toward her. "Teddy," she said, "I hardly recognized you. You're looking better than I remember." Thank God for that. No one had called me Teddy for years, but I'd be Grace's Teddy anytime. She had been a year ahead of me through high school, and word had it 10 grades ahead in necking and knowing what to do below the deck of a cabin cruiser. "You still hiding behind a newspaper?" she said. "Where's your camera?" I'd been that lanky kid taking photos while the rest of the class threw hoops or cheered from the bleachers. Granted, I was a nerd then, but I'd like to think I'd outgrown nerdhood. I'd really like her to think that. "You found Mo's boat," I said. "Did you see anything unusual, anything out of place?" I was collecting myself and doing what I did best, asking questions. She shrugged. "You knew Mo. He never left anything out of place. Even when the poor guy was going through such a hard time," she shook her head, "he and Charlotte separated that like that." Separated? Charlotte had looked broken up, but not with Mo. "He's been living on his boat the past week," Grace said, "and Charlotte recently took out a life insurance policy on him." "So you knew him well." I gazed at her tan legs again. constantly asking questions didn't make you popular in school, Teddy, she said. But no, I didn't know Mo that well. But he was good to me when I came back to take over my father's boat. She flipped the stern line off the cleat and pushed away from the dock. You must be hungry, I said, before she started the engine. Want to catch a bite at the diner? Sorry, gotta clean my boat, then I have plans. Tomorrow? I figured I'd ask. I'll be hauling late tomorrow, she said. I nodded and tried to pretend this hadn't happened to me before. Then before she backed away from the wharf, I sang her off with, "Pretty woman, the kind I like to meet." Have you had success with that line in the past? She said. Not a lot. We were pulling into the end of the day, and Rocco and I were back in our cramped newsroom. Rocco was researching commercial lobster licensing. It's hard for those who don't take over from their father, he said. It can take decades before your name comes to the top of the waiting list. I'm going to Augusta in the morning and check out that list. I was thinking how much I'd like to check out Grace Goodrow. I couldn't imagine her having anything to do with Mo's death, but then there'd be more lobsters to haul in with Mo out of the way. Zeke Stone had every reason to get rid of Mo. I'm headed over to Charlotte's, I said, find out about the insurance money. Thought no different, said Rocco. I might never get a Pulitzer or put Homesport on the list of best New England towns to visit. But if we solve this murder, maybe I could give Rocco a raise. Meanwhile, we'd memorialize a man who fought for the integrity of his livelihood, a man who heard music in the waves. His was a Maine story, a fisherman's story.
Pulp Fiction is known for its dialogue. The good Pulp Fiction is known for dialogue and sort of punchy sentences. But one thing that is often overlooked is world building. And that's something that Judith does really well over the course of these two stories. You could smell the sea salt, the sea tide, and feel the creak of the boards on the boat, and just those little moments of, grabbing the shot of, what did you call it? The shot of rocket fuel and a raisin muffin. Just these little moments of creating this world that this editor lives in that really makes a story. So well done, Judith. Thank you. Definitely worth reading from volume 2. Steve is looking at his watch, which suggests to me that if he had a hook, that he would be using that hook on me right now. But I'm the editor, so I can overrule him this one last time. He's a local boy, made very good. The 3 stories that are in volumes 1, volume 2, and volume 3, I'll let you talk about. I want to hear. I've always been interested in hearing where he got the idea for these stories. But talk about dialogue. Steve is a master at dialogue, and the black humor in these 3 stories is exactly what you would expect from a great Pulp Fiction detective writer. So I'm going to introduce S.J. Cahill, or Steve, as we all know and love him by, and I'll let him go from here. So S.J. Cahill, everybody.
I'm not going to tell Dan where I got the idea for the stories because he'll use them. So, Murder, Inc. is a 3-volume anthology. In book 1, there's a story called Solution 151, where an ambitious reporter murders the publisher of the Granite State Times so she can become the editor. By the end, in order to advance her career, she is turned into a serial killer. The story in Volume 2 involves a character from her story named Sanford Moulton. His story is called The Moulton Solution, and I'm going to read a very condensed version of it. So, The Moulton Solution. The editor of Granite State Times drank himself into a coma that stopped his heart, down and dead. It happens to alcoholics, but the chief sent me down to take a look, just in case. In case what? I said. Was there something suspicious? There's a protocol for unattended deaths. The locals may screw it up. What if I have a power struggle with a deputy dog constable? You're a detective, Sanford. Show them your badge. Take charge. By the time I arrived, his body had already been moved. The medical examiner had come and run a tox test, just in case, and the state's attorney released the body according to protocol. So much for taking charge. The only person who checked my badge was Gayleen Palmer, the reporter who found the body. She looked up from writing the late editor's obituary to explain how the paper would continue with a new format, including more feature articles, wider coverage, sensitive issues. And of course, her voice did a breathy catch, we'll do a series on alcoholism. Gayleen was a looker, beautiful by rural standards, good skin and facial bones, piercing black eyes, dark wavy hair, and dressed in clothes with more hooks and snaps and zippers than I'd ever seen. I wondered how they all worked. And more investigative reporting, she said. I'm planning a crime column, The Law, inside and out, and I'm wondering if, and she took another look at my badge, wondering if Detective Sanford Moulton might be available. You know, a background expert to read copy for authenticity, someone experienced with crime scene drama. Being a detective reads better than it lives. The day-to-day isn't as glamorous as stories in old crime and detective magazines would have it. But as a rural detective, I'd added my own drama to a couple of crime scenes. Gayleen jingled her silver bracelets and gave me a 100-watt smile. The bracelets were decorated with butterfly valves from old carburetors, and her necklace pendant looked like a spark plug from my old Chevy pickup, the haute couture of northern New England. She was standing so close I could smell her perfume and didn't know enough to say no. The press and law enforcement have a tricky relationship. So I couldn't tell her that police sometimes had to break rules, break laws to enforce them. Plant evidence, tap a phone without a warrant, do an illegal search and seizure, and I'd certainly never tell her that I'd broken rules and crossed lines myself. Never tell her that Sanford Moulton had his own solution when loopholes in the law and the cumbersome legal system failed or fell short. Now, I wasn't a vigilante or a rogue cop, but when the machinations of the law were so convoluted that murderers went free, I used the Moulton solution to balance the scales of justice, but only as a last resort. It was between me and my conscience, my covenant with God. Legal and ethical didn't count when it came to the serial rapist, the pedophile priest, or the child abductor who killed his victims. So if Gayleen came around looking for drama, I'd never tell her that cops made the best killers. A month later, she showed up in my office wearing knee-high leather boots and a short skirt with legs that went on forever, and a white silk blouse so sheer I could see the lace on her bra. An underbust Victorian corset cinched in her waist so tight, I wondered how she could breathe. I know I was having trouble. You're the one that broke the interstate drug ring, she said, the undercover detective they call Cowboy. I was wearing my Western shirt with mother of pearl buttons and new snakeskin boots. I gave her a modest smile and said, drug crimes are as popular as crimes of passion. Well, that's why I'm here. About the drug crimes or the crimes of passion? Both. She sat down and crossed her legs. But is passion always a crime? Which is when I felt things starting up between Gayleen and me. She took me home that night and let me take off those leather boots and undo that Victorian corset. The intricate lacings tested my fine motor skills, but fortunately, I'm ambidextrous. Gayleen's clothes ranged from medieval outfits and Renaissance dresses to aviator goggles with belts and bandoliers, from Gothic to sci-fi to avant-garde, steampunk for every occasion. The night she stopped by that station and seduced me in the evidence room, I swear to God, she was wearing a complicated leather chastity belt with an honest-to-Christ padlock holding it on. I thought I'd never find the little brass key on her necklace. But that night, she took a brick of fentanyl-laced heroin out of the evidence room, and I later discovered she was a serial killer. In the end, the only thing that could stop her was the molten solution. So I'm going to finish reading with an excerpt from the story in Murder, Inc. 3, and the female narrator is a peripheral character from earlier stories. Dan encouraged making these links, these connections. And this story is called The Canine Solution. Now, even though editor Dan is here, this is the hometown crowd. As he said, it's my family, right? So I'm going to read the ending that Dan and I both agreed was a little too cute, a little too flip for the series. But here is The Canine Solution. The church was filling up fast when I arrived. Celebrity funerals draw a crowd, and Gayleen Palmer had been a celebrity. Editor of Granite State Times, winner of a prestigious NNA award, Pulitzer nominee, and a syndicated columnist about to go national until last week. Then she became the third Granite State Times editor to die tragically in less than a year. This was what headlines are made of. Reporters and journalists from all over New England were here to pay homage and write new leads for an old story. Gayleen Palmer died from an accidental drug overdose. But I was sure she'd been responsible for the deaths of the first two. So I didn't believe for a single second that her death was accidental. I knew the woman. A man stopped me on my way in. Alexis Logan? He carried a pen and a small notebook like an old school reporter. What was working for Miss Palmer like the day-to-day with Gayleen? I'm a stringer, I said. I don't know day-to-day. But what about the newsroom climate when you did work there? I was an intern. Now I write a pet care column at home and send files to the layout desk. Well, Bark and Purr is a great column, he said. He'd done his homework and was trying to nice me up. But I'm wondering what Miss Palmer was really like. I shook my head and pushed past him into the church. The organist was playing Bach preludes, and my mind followed the chord progressions while I looked for a seat. We were at a funeral, and the reporter was out of line. Miss Palmer, indeed. Gayleen was the woman Kipling had in mind when he wrote, "The female of the species is more deadly than the male." Her style was steampunk and flamboyant. Her ambition had a scorched earth policy, and her writing was no holds barred. But she was one hell of an editor. She found the emotional core of a story, even hard news articles, by creating scenes and using dialogue the way it's used in fiction. Dialogue and details, hanging wallpaper, she called it, added a kind of Henry Jamesian point of view to her column that put the reader inside the mind of someone other than the writer. She had a detective boyfriend on a leash for an inside view of crime scenes, Sanford Moulton, her very own pet cop, and I found myself watching him during the service. He sat with his arms crossed, his shoulders relaxed against the back of the pew, and I watched the play of expressions on his face. There was sadness, yes, but the sorrow looked studied or rehearsed. He was composed but distant, reflective, more like an observer than someone experiencing the personal pain of grief and loss. And when the organ soared into "Nearer, My God, to Thee," I had my revelation. Sanford Moulton discovered that Gayleen was a killer, couldn't prove it, but couldn't let it go, and he resolved it by killing her. It was like an epiphany, and the realization coursed through me like an electric shock, a thunderbolt of certainty, sudden and definitive. Sanford Moulton killed Gayleen, I was sure of it. He glanced over and caught me staring, and I couldn't look at him for the rest of the service. Outside, when the mourners were walking to their cars, I looked back once and saw Sanford Moulton staring at me with his cold, metallic eyes. Back home at my kennel and grooming business, I tried not to think about him and shake off the feeling that he would come after me next. The chain link gate to my backyard was open, and I saw the dog come out of the woods behind the barn. It was a small dog, a terrier mix, with a scruffy face and matted coat, and it was sick. The color was what Border Terrier lovers called grizzle and tan, but the animal was so beat up and dirty it was hard to tell. The dog was moving erratically, staggering like a Skid Row drunk with its head swinging back and forth like a blind man's cane, and it was drooling. Not exactly foaming at the mouth, but salivating profusely with what my father called dog slobber. It made a frenzied attack on an empty water dish and went into convulsions, so I knew it was in extremis and didn't have long to live. I guessed it was probably rabies. When I was sure it was dead, I siphoned a vial of frothy spit from the dog's mouth to be tested later. Then I took the body to a pet crematorium. Sanford Moulton was waiting in my yard when I got home. He said he'd stop by to thank me for attending the funeral, but he wondered how well I'd known Galen. He wondered what I knew about the succession of editors at Granite State Times. He knew I was a link in the chain that could lead to an investigation of his involvement. A weak link, but the weakest link in a chain is the strongest when it breaks the chain. I could feel him making plans to get rid of me. He looked like he'd been fighting. His cowboy-style shirt was torn, his boot-cut Western jeans were grass-stained, and the side of his neck was oozing blood. I interrupted a domestic squabble on my way over, he said. But when I stopped the husband from hitting his wife, she came at me like a Bengal tiger with her claws out. Let me get something for your neck, I said. It's still bleeding. It could ruin your shirt. Rabies is the most fatal virus in the world, a pathogen that kills nearly 100% of its host in most species, including humans. Once the symptoms develop, no treatment can prevent the death of the patient. The decision came in that instant. There was no time for reflections on morality, no thoughts about right or wrong. It was like a reflex. The survival instinct at work. A killer was stalking me, and I was acting in self-defense. I'd had my pre-exposure vaccine, the PCEC shots, but I used rubber gloves and was very careful when I wet the Band-Aid pads with dog saliva from the vial. Back downstairs, I smoothed the Band-Aids over the scratches on his neck and covered them with surgical tape. Keep those on for a few days, I said. Don't pick the scab and you shouldn't have a scar. I truly didn't know then if the dog was really rabid or simply sick, but I certainly know now. The new editor at Granite State Times called asking me to come back as a full-time reporter. Had I heard about Galen's old boyfriend? I said I didn't know she had a boyfriend and what happened. Well, at first it was like the flu, fever, headache, muscle fatigue, but he started hallucinating. Now he's having muscle spasms and convulsions, and they think it may be rabies. Yes, it was, and it had only taken 10 days. Sanford Moulton wouldn't be coming after me now. Well, the rabies incubation period varies, I said. It's been known to take years. My God, the editor said. So they'll never know where he got it. But once the symptoms appear, his voice trailed off. Once the symptoms appear, I said, and finished it for him, it's too late. It's too late for me, too. When Sanford Moulton dies, which will be soon, I'll be a murderer, just like him. I expected an assault from my conscience, but I felt a healing balm wash through my mind. It was over. The fear and tension from sleepless nights slowly drained away, and the community was safe from a rogue cop. I was surprised not to feel guilty. No waves of regret and remorse, no wishing I hadn't done it. None of that at all. Of course, there's relief. How could there not be? But beyond that comes a deeper sense of accomplishment and pride. And even deeper is a feeling of spiritual fulfillment. So now I'm the heroine of my own life story. And like all heroines in all stories, I'm a changed character. I've gone from a fearful, small-town pet columnist to a stone-cold killer. And I like it. I'm an action hero now, capable of converting a lethal pathogen into a force for good, and I'm calling it the canine solution. Now, I've read about people like me in crime story collections. I'm already thinking about writing my own story. Maybe it'll get published in a pulp fiction anthology and used at library readings, or maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, right? So we're gonna, Steve and Judith will be happy to sign copies of the books, but I actually wanted to bring them both up and do some Q&A with the two of them. And now is a good time to ask them about their inspiration or their stories or their writing habits. Or let's bring Steve and Judith up. And if you guys have any questions for them, please shoot. You must have some questions.
So Steve, was that a premiere presentation, that story right here?
Yes. Yes, it was. And I did it just for you, Bob.
Can both of you just talk about, I mean, obviously this is in the genre of pulp fiction, but do you write, what else do you write? And is this something new for you, or have you always loved pulp fiction? Sort of, what else do you write and how did you get to this?
We're both novelists, and I'm happy to tell you that the first chapter of Judith's novel will be published this summer in The Meadow. So, and yes, we both write a lot of poetry. Judith does a lot of poetry, but I can't rhyme, and so.
Neither do I. Very much. Yeah, for me, this is all new. I mean, I was really looking forward to hearing Dan talk about pulp fiction. And what happened for me was, I have been writing fiction for a while, but Steve submitted to the first Murder, Inc., and I had the chance to go to Boston and hear this reading, and here were, I think there may be 12 or something like that, writers about this pulp newsroom murder stuff, and I just drank it up. It was so fun, you know, and all these different voices and the pace of it, and this community, like he's talking about, you know, we're talking about a murder, but people, the writers in it, and Dan, it's like a community, and it's really fun. So I just went back and, oh my gosh, I got to do this. So I did, and for me, you know, I was steeped on the coastal Maine with fishermen and everything, and that's where I am. So that's what I think, you know, okay, it's got to be on a lobster boat or something like that. And just one more thing I wanted to share is that a lot of times, I mean, all my life, growing up on the coast of Maine, I would watch movies where people were portraying Maine fishermen, and it used to drive me crazy because you know if you're there, and if you're, you know, if you're in the kingdom, you know if someone's conveying the kingdom. I mean, it's hard to do, and so I guess I felt inspired to show fishermen, now here's a murder, but it's an opportunity to show what, I guess I use the word integrity, but really there is an integrity in that industry, and there's no, the other thing in my other story, it was, they don't get subsidies like farmers do, you know, when your boat goes, they have something and that's it. So it's a hard life. Anyway.
Were you saying that fishermen are better than farmers?
How do you hone your skills? And do you do workshops over the years?
Pardon?
How do you hone your skills? Or have you done workshops for many years to
Well, we've
what you are?
been writing and sending stuff here and there, and we get a lot of rejections, and then we meet people like Dan who tightens things up for us. He's an incredible editor. I mean, I got a note back from him once. No, Steve, this is you trying to tell the reader something. The character already knows it. Find a better way to do it. And other editors would feel, Dan always lets us do the writing, but he kind of guides us. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your sort of work-a-day like? Like, do you have a place that you like to write? Do you write for a certain amount of hours a day? What's your schedule?
I stay in bed all day. It was difficult to get up to come down here this evening. No, I don't have a real good schedule, but basically I write in the mornings if I can, and then sleep in the afternoons. You got a schedule? Did I answer that?
Yeah, we write a lot, though. It's and it is when the gentleman asked, and it is something that once you start, be careful, because it really it's hard not to do it. If it catches, it's in there, and it's almost like the old water pump, and once you start pumping it, I mean, it just feels like you need to be doing it, or life isn't quite right. So, so be careful if you get started. But there are lots of little workshops and groups. We've been part of a writing group down in fact, there are two ladies who came away from White River and Lyme, New Hampshire, but we've been part of this novel writing group for at least 15 years, I think, 16 or 17, and still haven't published our novels. But it'll happen.
Yeah.
Judith, can you tell us a little bit about your novel that's just, as you said, the first chapter has just been accepted?
Oh, very different. It's about my father-in-law was my inspiration, but he was a Japanese prisoner of war for 4 years during the Second World War. So he's one narrator, and then there's a young woman who, and what happens is that he's Malaysian and Indian, so there is and his son has moved to America and found a job there. So it's about his transition to living in America. But I think what the inspiration of that novel is that this man came through hell ships, he came through 4 years, he survived, a lot didn't. But after surviving that, just has this sense of peace. He's still alive. He's 96 now. He's my father-in-law. And he had this thing, which I was so drawn to, and I just love him to pieces. And, but it's a fiction story. Everything else is fiction, but it has a lot of tropical orchids. It's called Tala's Garden, so it's about orchids and a lot of lush that is nice to revisit right now. That's how we travel, is right.
Okay.
Judith and Steve. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Judith and Steve are going to stick around as long as you're here, and they'll sign copies of the books, and I'm sure they'll happy to answer more questions for you. We're just going to hang out over there, and we hope to see you again. Thank you so much for coming.